Welcome to Hudson RPO's podcast on racial equality and diversity. Hear from Hudson RPO leaders as they encourage organizations to just start on their D&I journey.
Hello, once again, I'm Jeremiah Stone, back with my colleagues Mark Rogers, Gary Jones, and Casey Butler. And we're just following up on our last two sessions where we talked about a number of tactical approaches to resolving issues in the DEI space that we've seen either deployed or talked about within the clients that we've worked with. So we've talked about blind resume submission. We've talked about sort of having a minimum number of diverse candidates on every slate. We've talked about unconscious bias training and talked about something else which is escaping me at the moment, but we've talked about a lot of sort of tactical efforts that companies are looking at undertaking. And I think our conclusion across a number of them was, one, maybe there's some pro cons, maybe they don't always work. Maybe they are helpful, as in like really helpful, as in the case of unconscious bias, but not sufficient to sort of solve the issues that they're meant to address. And that, tactics alone can't be the entire solution to resolving of systemic issues that results in companies having issues in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I guess that all begs the question, all right, if each of these individual tactics by themselves collectively, if that's not sufficient to start to unravel the issues in the DEI space, what is? What actually gets to or gets us on the path towards building a more diverse and equitable workforce? And Mark, I saw your head nod, so that one goes to you. Where do we go from here?
So I'll tell you what I think, and then of course, as usual, would love to hear Casey and Gary's perspective. I think we've talked about tactics, and I think it would be easy for viewers to think that based on some of the conversations that we've had in previous episodes that we're poo-pooing everything, and it's not that we're poo-pooing everything. I think that the tactics need to be plentiful, and they need to be across multiple, different areas relative to DEI. I think it starts again with the mission, and I keep saying that. Who are you as an organization? What is your values around DEI? What organizationally? What are your beliefs? And then it comes to establishing the baseline processes, policies, and guidelines foundationally to make sure that you have the guidelines in place to establish DEI, that everyone is kind of operating from the same or similar playbook. We talked a lot about unconscious bias training, so that's not the end all to be all to education and training, but ongoing education is super, super important beyond unconscious bias. And then engagement, I think that's something that is often missed, and really authentic engagement, not just the check boxes, but really getting your employee base across multiple demographics, exposure to one another, having frank conversations, courageous conversations, educating one another about your own experiences while, illuminating your shared experiences. And then ultimately, I think it comes down at the end of the day to accountability. And I think a lot of times when you think about, the companies that you worked with or worked for, they're lacking in at least one or all of these ways. And if you're not covering all of those, those 5 or 6 areas, particularly accountability, you're really going to struggle to see some tangible results. So for me, though, I think that the cynic in me says, and we talked about this in the last episode, that the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion is not necessarily being sold really well, because there's still a lot of people in the corporate world who don't believe that there's a need for this. So the accountability piece is really, super important, and to have leaders be willing to step up and say, look, you're not driving this in your business unit. You're not driving this within your part of the organization. Then from a mission and vision and cultural standpoint, you're, as a leader, not a fit here. Having the ability to have leaders make that statement and do it in a meaningful way, I think is super important. So that was a lot. Gary, Casey, what say you?
No, I think it was a lot. I think I like poo-pooing. I like that. I'm
Not poo-pooing.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think that, one of the things that we talked about were, where is your company deficient? When you look at, Is it lack of representation, within your workforce? Is it the perception internally with your employees? Is it an external market perception issue? And really kind of making sure that everything that we talked about is customized to really kind of address where those deficiencies are, right? And then having a way to measure improvement. We know it's an ongoing thing, so what's the baseline of that deficiency, and how do we continue to use all of these tools and use all of these suggested methods, and then measure the improvement. So whether it be through surveys, whether it be through actual data in terms of hiring metrics, those types of things, just continuing to have the ability to measure how you're improving, throughout the process. And that's going to be your measuring stick, so that you can continue to see, are these tactics working, or do we need to re-customize? Do we need to redeploy? So those are the types of things that I think that companies should take on, or even individual departments within companies should understand as they start their journey and continue the journey, on that front. Case?
Yeah, I was just, it makes me just think accountability seems to be the key word for all of us, because you can arm people with all of these tactics and keep people informed and aware, but if you don't measure whether or not they're actually working, are people actually putting them in action, then how useful are they? And so I think it really just comes down to making that shift from, it's not just tactical, but it is behaviors that we're altering, not just, giving people a toolkit. We need to make sure that they're actually using it. And that's a behavioral change, not just, providing the kit in the first place. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that, the employers that we work with and employers that I hear from, it's making that transition. They've got great ideas on the tools. We talked a lot about the tools on our previous podcast. But it's like, how do we make sure that people are then taking everything that we're making them aware of and actually applying it? And I think that's when you have, Mark, you touched on that, those conversations and having difficult conversations and courageous conversations around, calling people out when they're not making that behavior change, and realizing that if you're not going to make the behavior change, you're no longer the right cultural complement to our organization. And I think those are really difficult conversations, especially when you're talking about perhaps talent that has a lot of have longevity within the organization and expertise that may be difficult to find, but nothing's going to change if you allow people to just continue to behave in the same way they did before.
Yeah, look, so I think what I'm hearing is that, so going back to Mark, like starting with mission and starting with vision and starting with like an authentic expression of what direction a company is going to go in is you got to start there, right? Like you don't know where you can't get there if you don't know where you're going. But that along with all the tactical approaches that support that is not sufficient if you're not introducing the structures of accountability that start to change behavior, because creating awareness is important, it's great, it's necessary, but as with anything in life, being aware of something, being aware of, maybe you need to exercise more or whatever else, it doesn't necessarily start to change the behavior unless systems of accountability and systems of reinforcement are introduced. So are there any thoughts about what that could look like, these systems of accountability? Like, how does accountability get introduced into the space of reinforcing behavior?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways, especially when you talk about leadership and pushing DEI, down into the organization. I've seen it work really well, where obviously you're periodically monitoring, metrics, improvement, regression, but also tying, outcomes to performance. Mm-hmm. And that both means professional performance, but then also financial, outcomes and impacting the wallet. And I really think that that's where, at the end of the day, I'm sad to say, I think people will respond in general more to, it being incorporated into a performance, and a DEI being an expectation of, hey, this is not just a thing. It's an organizational capability. And so we're going to measure your capability and delivery in this area, both from a performance and financial standpoint, or with financial, potentially financial impact. Like, I think that is the holy grail of, where it should go. Ideally, you're changing hearts and minds, but at the end of the day, people really understand data. They understand, finance.
Mm-hmm. And I actually have worked with a client that did just that.
Mm-hmm.
They tied the bonus component of compensation into their ability to live the values of the organization, one of which being, diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I would say that they are now further along the journey. No one, they're not, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but I would say it's definitely they're further along the journey than I've seen with some of my other clients who haven't linked it back, and given it that much accountability that it does impact the person's bottom line, so to speak. And some people will change without that, but I think that to get the most out of what you're putting in and get the most accountability, I think tying it into something like that is definitely valuable.
I think it helps in driving data. Again, the one thing that we want to do is make sure that the change is genuine, make sure that the engagement is there and no one's checking a box for a bonus, or understanding that your performance management is tied into simply data, right? And data is a way you can tell. And certainly tying in bonuses absolutely helps, in terms of doing things the right way. But are they 100% engaged? I think that tying data reports into responses and surveys, you have to continue to have voices from your folks internally. You have to get that anecdotal perception. You have to tie that in. So periodic surveys, the ability to come in and continue to talk through this is something that I think is going to be very important, so you can see some of that additional commentary around what the perception is in terms of, is it better than before? And again, treat it like a baseline, just like we do the interview. Same questions are asked, and are the perceptions the same, or are they different, or are they not? So when you look at those types of things, I think that being able to have a forum where you can consistently gather commentary, anecdotal and additional commentary and perceptions from your internal population is going to be key as well going.
Yeah, I think that's a good. Yeah, that's a
Go
good
ahead.
dot on the I. Sorry, Casey. Is the internal, self accountability piece, and not just accountability for oneself, but the accountability across the organization for your peers, your coworkers, to really own culturally how this happens. DEI happens within the organization, so it becomes part of the culture and conversations and dialogue. So it's an expectation as opposed, an expectation culturally across the organization, as opposed to being something that gets pushed down and gets lost.
And I was just thinking back to one of our first podcasts where we talked about, making an environment and creating an environment in such a way where people feel comfortable in talking, and then giving people the opportunity to listen. And I think that sort of lends with what you're saying, Gary, is, you can send out surveys, but if people don't feel like it's a safe place to be able to really say what they want to say, then you're not going to get what you need from that information. And so I think, if I remember correctly, it was our first Just Start podcast where we were talking about creating that safe environment, to have these dialogues. And it's interesting that without that, you can't get to this point. You really, you need to, it's a journey. It's not just about a couple of things. It's really about trying to find ways to incorporate multiple different approaches, versus just having one answer to the overall solution.
Well, thanks for bringing it back to that full circle moment, Casey. Maybe that's a good place to wrap up. I do want to just summarize what I think I heard there to try to tie all these themes together. Ultimately, back to the business case that Mark brought up at the beginning of our discussion today. If you as an organization truly do believe in the business case for building a more diverse workforce, then treat it with the same attention, energy, and data as you would any other product build or launch. And incentivize the good and disincentivize the bad, and monitor progress and hold yourself accountable to delivering that. You know, if you're digitizing a platform or a product, you wouldn't allow sort of a loosey-goosey approach to that and we'll just sort of see what happens. You would drive to get to the outcome. And I think we need that same kind of energy in the DEI space. Like, companies know how to achieve outcomes. I think they need to translate that energy into diversity, equity, inclusion, because it is part of the business case and an essential part of the business case. So
Absolutely.
I think that's what I heard in sum total.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think I heard at the beginning of this conversation before we started the podcast is our appreciation for our executive producer, Debbie Nowicki, whose last day with us was today. She's been the heart and soul of this podcast, even if the audience hasn't seen her. We feel her, and we will continue to feel her. I'm sure you guys feel similarly.
Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you, Deb.
She'll be missed. She'll be missed for sure. So thank you for everything, Deb.
Yes.
And on that note, this is our last podcast of the year. So goodbye 2020. But it's been fantastic to write it out with all of you. Mark, Gary, Casey, thanks so much once again.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Safe, happy holidays, folks.
Happy holidays, guys. Yeah.
Bye-bye now.
To speak with any of today's participants about your Just Start journey, email juststart@hudsonrpo.com.